Daniel parked his car at the edge of the property, the engine's hum fading into an almost oppressive silence that wrapped around the cabin. He sat for a moment, just staring at the small wooden structure that, despite its weathered appearance, looked stubbornly unchanged. Every detail seemed to beckon memories. The creaky step leading to the porch, the cracked window pane in the living room, the sun and rain-battered walls. This was the last place he ever imagined returning to, yet here he was, face to face with the ghosts of his past. With a deep breath, he grabbed his keys and stepped out of the car, feeling the earth soft under his feet. He had promised himself he'd return to clear everything out, sort through his late parents' belongings, and finally sell the place. But now, standing before the cabin, the thought of letting go felt far heavier than he'd expected. The door groaned as he pushed it open, echoing through the silent cabin. As he crossed the threshold, a wave of memories hit him. The smell of aged wood, the gentle light filtering through the cracks in the windows, and above all, the overwhelming sense that time had stopped here. It was as if the cabin had been waiting, untouched and unchanged, for him to return. Dust coated the old furniture, and the air was thick with the sense of earth and overgrown grass outside. Daniel moved to the fireplace, running his fingers through the thin layer of dust on the mantel. He remembered summers spent here, the warm glow of the fire filling the room, the sounds of laughter bouncing off the walls, and, at times, the uneasy silences that hung over the long nights. It was by this fireplace that he had often watched his father, trying to decipher the distant look in his eyes, the expression that always seemed just out of reach. As he walked around the small room, he could feel the weight of memories in every corner, in every small detail that made this cabin a place of his childhood, yet also a site of unresolved tensions. His mind drifted back to that last summer here with his father, a summer he would later wish had been different. For years, he had tried to lock away these memories, but here, now, they washed over him, as if he were standing in a dense fog made of the sensations he had tried so hard to forget. Then his eyes fell on an old box tucked away in the corner, half covered by a worn blanket. He hesitated, but something inside him urged him to look. It was as if the cabin itself, alive and pulsing with buried energy, was demanding his attention, insisting that he face everything he had tried so hard to leave behind. Daniel opened the box in the corner of the room, his hands slightly trembling as if touching something sacred and untouchable. Inside, he found faded photo albums, old toys, and letters yellowed by time. He picked up a photograph of himself as a boy, proudly holding a fish with his father beside him, smiling with his arm protectively around Daniel's shoulders. It was one of the rare moments he remembered seeing his father truly happy, without the shadow of worries that often weighed him down. Holding the photo, Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. The silence of the cabin seemed to amplify everything. The sound of his breathing, the creak of the floor beneath his feet, and, above all, the echo of words that had gone unsaid. The memory of that summer, the last one they spent together there, pulsed vividly in his mind. He remembered the arguments, the moments of misunderstanding, and the constant feeling that they lived in parallel worlds, incapable of connecting. He walked around the cabin, each step heavy with memories. He saw the worn-out couch where his mother used to sit and read, her voice calm and soothing as she told him stories on rainy days. He glanced at the small wooden table where they had shared countless dinners, his father always sitting in silence, lost in his thoughts. Daniel had resented those silences, felt them as walls his father had built between them. He'd spent years wondering if there was something he could have done to break through those walls, to find the father he sensed was hidden underneath. As he moved from room to room, memories flooded back, unbidden and overwhelming. The bedroom still held the faded curtains his mother had sewn, and the faint smell of pine lingered, mixed with the scent of old wood. He paused by the narrow hallway leading to the back door, a place he'd often run through as a child, eager to escape into the woods and the freedom of the lake. Now, standing there as an adult, he felt like he was walking through a labyrinth of his own past, each corner bringing him face to face with emotions he had long buried. That night, after hours of sifting through old keepsakes, He sat alone by the cold, empty fireplace, listening to the night sounds filtering in from outside. Somewhere in the darkness, a distant owl hooted, and the wind rustled through the trees. He felt the weight of regret settling over him, thick and heavy. All the anger he had carried toward his father, all the resentment he had allowed to fester, felt like shackles now. He realized he had been running from these feelings for years, but sitting here, in the heart of his memories, there was no escaping them. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to grieve, not just for his father, but for the relationship they could have had, for the years lost to misunderstandings and silence. As the evening shadows lengthened, Daniel finally gathered the courage to open the old box in the corner. The scent of aged paper and dust wafted up as he lifted the lid, and he sifted through faded photographs, crumbling letters, and small trinkets he remembered from childhood. His fingers paused over a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked but unmistakably familiar. The initials R and H, his father's, were faintly embossed on the front. Daniel's pulse quickened. He never knew his father kept a journal. Sitting down on the worn couch, Daniel hesitated, almost as if he were about to intrude on his father's private world. But the pull of curiosity, the chance to understand this distant figure in his life, outweighed his hesitation. He opened the journal, his eyes scanning the slightly faded handwriting, the words uneven and raw, as if his father had poured himself onto the page without filter. The first entries were simple and direct, observations about the cabin, the weather, and little moments from daily life. But as he turned the pages, Daniel felt himself being pulled into a different world. His father's words grew more reflective, revealing glimpses of a man Daniel barely recognized. He wrote about his fears and insecurities, his doubts as a father, and the loneliness that sometimes crept over him like a shadow. There was an entry about a summer night spent watching Daniel sleep, when he was still a boy, and his father had wondered aloud on the page if he was being a good parent. The words, "I'm not sure he understands how much I want to protect him, even if I don't know how to show it," struck Daniel like a blow. In his father's clumsy handwriting, he found vulnerability and longing. A man striving to connect, yet struggling to bridge the gap between himself and his son. With every page, Daniel felt his perception of his father shifting, bit by bit. The journal revealed a man who was far from perfect, but who cared deeply for Daniel and his family, and who silently struggled with his own demons. There were entries about regrets he carried from his own father, choices he made that he wished he could change. Daniel could almost feel his father's presence beside him, hear the weight in his voice that was never expressed. He continued reading, now unable to stop, as if he were discovering a puzzle piece of his past that had always been missing. The words painted a complex portrait of his father, one he had never had the chance to know. And in that quiet cabin, Daniel felt emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A strange blend of sadness, understanding, and even a flicker of forgiveness. Turning to the last entry, Daniel saw the date. It was from that final summer, the one that had left so many wounds unhealed. The entry ended abruptly, unfinished, as if his father had meant to say more but couldn't bring himself to write the rest. The final entry lingered in Daniel's mind as he sat in the dim light of the cabin, turning the unfinished words over in his head. His father's last thoughts, cut off mid-sentence, left an aching sense of incompletion that mirrored Daniel's own feelings toward him. He had carried resentment for so many years, resentments that now seemed to unravel, revealing layers of misunderstandings and unmet expectations between them. Daniel realized that he'd never truly known the man who had raised him. As he closed the journal, a quiet realization settled over him. His father had struggled just as he did, only he'd borne his battles in silence. The memory of his father's stern, sometimes distant demeanor had always been a source of bitterness. Yet now Daniel saw that silence as a mask, hiding a man who had cared deeply but didn't know how to express it. The journal entries reflected fears Daniel recognized within himself: the need to protect, the fear of failure, the weight of unspoken expectations. Driven by this newfound understanding, Daniel wandered through the cabin, noticing things he'd once overlooked. The fishing rod leaning by the door, worn from countless days spent on the lake. His father's old toolbox, where each tool was meticulously kept, was a testament to his precise, careful nature. And in the small, rarely used bookshelf in the corner, Daniel found books on everything from woodworking to philosophy, interests he had never known his father had. He recalled moments that now made more sense. The time his father had taught him to fish, his rough hands guiding Daniel's own as he cast the line for the first time. The fishing trips that had felt more like chores suddenly took on new meaning. He saw them now as attempts to bond, to pass on knowledge, however clumsily. Those silences by the lake, once a source of frustration, now seemed laden with purpose, with a father's quiet pride watching his son grow up before him. As he stood by the window, staring out at the lake glimmering in the fading daylight, Daniel realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving his father of his flaws, but about accepting him as a whole person. A man who, like him, had his own battles, regrets, and dreams. The anger he had carried for so long started to soften, replaced by a deep, bittersweet sadness for the missed opportunities between them. For the first time, Daniel felt he could let go of the bitterness that had festered for years, making room instead for compassion and empathy toward a man he never fully understood. In that quiet moment, he knew he was ready to face his father's memory, not with resentment, but with a tender acceptance that they had both done the best they could with what they had. With the journal now closed, Daniel felt a simmering restlessness. The words he had read in his father's handwriting were revealing, even healing, yet they left something unsettled within him. He realized that he needed more than just understanding. He needed closure. The last entry, so abruptly cut off, gnawed at him like an unsolved mystery, a conversation that had been left hanging in the air. Determined, he dug through more of the boxes in the corner, driven by an urge to unearth anything that might complete the picture his father had left him. After a few minutes of searching, his fingers brushed against an envelope tucked beneath a stack of dusty papers. His own name, Daniel, was scrawled across the front in the same familiar, jagged handwriting. The paper was worn, as if it had been folded and refolded, handled with hesitation. With a sense of reverence, Daniel opened the envelope, carefully pulling out a letter that was filled with cramped but deliberate writing. He took a deep breath and began to read. The letter started with words that were both formal and painfully honest. His father had written it during that final summer, expressing regrets, hopes, and reflections on their strained relationship. He acknowledged his own failings, the times he'd been too harsh, too silent, too distant. "I wanted to teach you strength, but I know I sometimes mistook strength for distance," he admitted. There was an apology that Daniel had never expected to read, a confession that his father had been uncertain, afraid, and at times overwhelmed by the role of raising a son on his own terms. The words spoke to the heart of everything Daniel had questioned over the years. His father had cared deeply, but the burdens of his own insecurities had held him back from showing it fully. In the letter, his father asked for forgiveness. Not explicitly, but between the lines, there was a plea for understanding. He had tried to be a man his son could respect, even if he wasn't always a man his son could easily love. As Daniel's eyes reached the final paragraph, he found himself choking up. His father had written, "I hope someday you'll see the reasons behind my silence, my mistakes. I know I should have told you this in person, but words often failed me. If you're reading this, it means I've left things unfinished. I hope you find the peace I couldn't find for myself." The weight of those words settled heavily in Daniel's chest. He felt anger and sorrow intertwined. Anger that they had never been able to have this conversation face to face, sorrow that his father had carried so much alone. But even more than that, he felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Love, raw and unfiltered, for a man who had done his best, even if his best had sometimes fallen short. Determined to find a way to honor this newfound understanding, Daniel made a decision. He would keep the cabin at least for a while longer. Instead of selling it, he would use it as a place to remember his father's words, to reflect on the parts of him that he had finally come to see. Perhaps, by keeping the cabin, he could begin to heal the wounds that had kept them both from connecting. In that quiet, sacred moment, Daniel whispered into the empty room, "I forgive you, Dad." And in the stillness that followed, he felt a peace settling over him, like a weight that had been lifted, leaving space for a new beginning. Just as Daniel was gathering his things, ready to leave the cabin with a newfound sense of peace, he heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel outside. Surprised, he looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck pulling into the driveway. Stepping out was an older man with a weathered face and a purposeful stride, carrying an air of familiarity that Daniel couldn't immediately place. The man approached the cabin, a slow smile forming as he saw Daniel in the doorway. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice rich with warmth. "You've grown, Daniel. Last time I saw you, you were just a kid." It took Daniel a moment, but then he recognized him. Mr. Wilkins, his father's closest friend. They had fished together every summer, laughed together on the porch, and, when things got too quiet, shared long, meaningful silences. But Daniel had rarely spoken with him, only catching glimpses of their friendship from a distance. Mr. Wilkins carried a small bundle in his hands, and as he stepped into the cabin, he looked around with a solemn reverence, taking in the familiar setting. "Your dad told me to come here one last time," he explained. "He said that when the time was right, I'd know. And seeing you here, I think this is it." Curious, Daniel invited him to sit down, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and relief. Mr. Wilkins began to share stories, some funny, some touching, some that painted his father in a light Daniel had never seen. He spoke of his father's loyal nature, his unspoken struggles, and his quiet acts of kindness. As Daniel listened, he felt his understanding of his father deepen. His father's reserved nature, his reluctance to express emotions openly, was tempered by acts of devotion that had gone unnoticed. Mr. Wilkins reached into the bundle he had brought and pulled out a small, carved wooden box. Handing it to Daniel, he said, "Your dad made this for you. Worked on it for months, but he was too proud to give it to you himself. Told me to pass it on when I thought you were ready." Daniel's hands shook slightly as he opened the box, revealing a small collection of items. A fishing lure his father had carved, a weathered compass, and a handwritten note. The note was simple but powerful. In his father's familiar handwriting, the words read, "May you always find your way." The compass, Daniel realized, was a symbol, an offering of guidance in the silent way his father had known. The lure, painstakingly crafted, was a reminder of the moments they had spent on the lake, an unspoken invitation to keep those memories alive. Listening to Mr. Wilkins, Daniel saw his father through his friend's eyes, a man who had loved deeply, albeit imperfectly. Mr. Wilkins finished with a quiet sigh. "Your dad wasn't a perfect man, but he was the best friend I ever had. He may not have said it, but he was proud of you. Just didn't always know how to show it." The visit left Daniel feeling both grounded and uplifted. He now held not only his father's words and confessions, but the memories of a loyal friendship that had given his father strength in his own struggles. In Mr. Wilkins' stories and in the small tokens his father had left behind, Daniel felt a closeness he had never expected to find, as if he could finally hold on to his father's legacy with both hands. As they said their goodbyes, Mr. Wilkins put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his eyes kind but heavy with emotion. "Take care of this place, Daniel," he said. "It was where your dad felt most himself. And maybe, in time, you'll find it's where you feel the same." With a final nod, Mr. Wilkins left, leaving Daniel alone once more, but not nearly as lonely as he had felt before. Holding the compass in his hand, Daniel felt like he'd been given a direction, a quiet assurance that perhaps this cabin was more than a relic of painful memories. It was a place where he could learn, heal, and perhaps even reconnect with himself. As the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting soft golden light across the cabin, Daniel sat on the porch steps, the compass still in his hand. The lake glistened quietly in the distance, calm and reflective, much like the thoughts stirring within him. He had come to the cabin with the intent of putting it, and his past, to rest, yet here he was, feeling something entirely unexpected, a sense of belonging. He looked around, taking in the weathered wood of the porch, the gentle creak of the boards beneath his feet, the familiar smell of pine and earth. Each element of this place, once burdened with painful memories, now felt transformed. It was as though every object, every inch of the cabin, was infused with new meaning, an invitation not just to remember his father, but to reconcile with himself. Daniel knew he couldn't leave just yet. For the first time, he felt a pull to preserve this place, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to build on the fragments of connection he had uncovered. The journal, the letter, the compass, and Mr. Wilkins' stories had woven together a picture of his father that he would carry forward, imperfect but honest. And somewhere within that picture, he began to see his own reflection. Determined, Daniel began to set the cabin in order, feeling an unfamiliar joy in the simple act of caring for it. He dusted off the old furniture, repaired the porch step that had always creaked, and even ventured to the lake, where he cast the line from his father's handcrafted lure. Standing by the water's edge, he imagined his father's presence beside him, silent but full of unspoken pride. It was no longer just a painful reminder of what had been missing. It was a place where he could create something new. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself falling into a quiet rhythm, each task a way of honoring his father's legacy and discovering his own. The solitude of the cabin brought clarity, helping him sort through feelings he had avoided for years. The anger he had carried slowly dissipated, replaced by understanding, and in that space he felt a newfound strength, a determination to face his own life with the same resilience his father had shown, in his own way. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, Daniel read through the last pages of the journal once more. But this time he felt no emptiness, no lingering ache. Instead, he felt a deep gratitude for what he had discovered. His father's unfinished words had left him with the opportunity to write his own ending, to carry forward what his father had left behind, while building a life that reflected his own values and aspirations. With one last glance around the cabin, Daniel made a promise to himself. He would return to this place not to relive the past, but to build upon it. The cabin was no longer just a memory. It was now part of his future, a refuge and a place of peace. It had become more than just walls and a roof. It was the bridge between him and his father, a link to his own inner strength, and a reminder of forgiveness, love, and growth. As he locked the cabin door behind him, Daniel felt lighter, as if the burdens he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. The compass in his pocket felt warm, a silent guide pointing him forward. He didn't know where life would take him next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he had found his way. Thank you for spending your time with us. If this story touched you, subscribe to embrace the journey for many more.